The morning the world narrowed to a single point of white light, I was already awake in the small hours. A cup of coffee gone cold on the windowsill, and the hum of the city still in that liminal place between night and work. I had learned over 15 years of suits and clearances and the slow, sacred calculus of launch windows that silence is a kind of prayer, listening for the small, impossible things that might break. The alarm on my phone read February 8th, 2003. But that date meant nothing to the stars. It meant everything to us. Columbia would be re-entering in the afternoon, and the flight dynamics team had been running re-entry sims since dawn. I pulled on a sweater, the same blue one I always wore under my badge when I knew I would need some armor. Outside, the sky over Houston was the washed silver of winter. Inside, the mission control room already breathed. My badge shuffled me through the scanner like sugar. The fluorescent hum of Building 30 was familiar as a heartbeat. The humidity in the hallway smelled like ozone and paper. People moved with that focused composure you learn when other people's lives are literally in the balance. We all had a list of rituals, checklists, handoffs, quiet jokes that kept panic at bay. I kept mine to one thing I carried in the pocket of my sweater, a photograph of my daughter, Ellie, taken on the playground 2 summers ago. She looks into the camera with a face that belongs to a person who trusts the world to be sturdy. I thought of her more than once that day and pressed the paper until the edges softened against my fingers. I was a thermal systems engineer by title, but the job that morning was less about equations and more about temperament. Columbia had been my constant, the way the aluminum sang under tests, the stubborn smell of putty in the hangar, the rituals before launch. I loved that stubborn thing like you love a complicated parent. It demanded respect and paid back in small, clear accidents of beauty. The way atmosphere thinned and blue opened like a promise. That day, though, the blue held an anxious edge. During Ascent, a chunk of foam had separated from the external tank. The video replay in the control room showed it tumbling against Columbia's left wing like a bird hitting a window. We had run the models and dismissed the worst-case scenarios. The numbers were neat, the probabilities comforting. At 3:50 p.m., Columbia was scheduled to burn through the sky and then come home. We dressed our fears in math. The first microhook, I remember the way the feed hiccuped, a tiny staccato in the middle of our routine, and everyone laughed like children to push the feeling down. If a moment after that could have been a warning, it was the noise of the laughter itself, brittle, thin as ice. I told myself I was being childish when my throat closed. It was a superstition, that brittle laugh. We are people trained to accept improbable tragedies, and superstition is the thin seam where our training meets the body. The earlier weeks had been full of small unease. An engineer from the imaging team had asked for permission to task a camera to photograph the suspected damage to the wing. Permission got tangled in a web of chain of command and risk assessment. Too much time, too much distraction from the nominal mission plan. And what we lost there was the gentle, human allowance for curiosity. I argued for it, quietly and with the soft force of someone seasoned at pushing through petty bureaucracies. My voice was one of many. In the end, we didn't get the picture we needed. That detail keeps me awake at night more than anything else. Not because the camera would have saved them for certain, but because the absence of that image became the place where doubt takes root. We spent the last hour before landing in the flight dynamics console, watching numerical rivers on the displays. The reentry corridor is a perfect, brutal mathematics of heat and angle. The shuttle has to thread the eye of a needle. For 37 years, we had taught ourselves to love that needle. The voices around me were a soft tide of jargon and humor. Trajectories hold, someone said, as if making the words could make them true. The public feed had callers and anchors, families, and 100 strangers. people who didn't know our rituals, but knew how to hold their breath with us. We readied the procedures for blackout recovery, the jokes about the cafeteria, the little shared histories that made a long job soft enough to bear. When the telemetry from Columbia began to come back in full during reentry, the room leaned forward as if gravity itself had shifted. Temperatures rose on the screens in ways that were both elegant and terrifying. Spaces that had always sat on the edge of tolerable, pruned with numbers climbing like fingers. We had protocols for data that flashed outside norms. Stop, analyze, consult. I remember the taste of metal when I swallowed, a dryness at the back of my tongue that felt like a physical alarm. The first unmistakable anomaly came as a mosaic of minor alarms, synthetic, clinical sounds. Left wing leading edge temperatures trending high, a voice noted. The words were precise, almost neutral. My hands were on the console. You always reach for the things you know, to remind your fingers of competence. I checked the readouts. An isolated sensor had spiked. We started cross-checking. Another spike, then another, non-linear, not consistent with the expected atmospheric heating profile. A ripple went through the team. Could be sensor, someone said. The more we said that, the more I felt the sentence turning into a plea. The second micro hook, I saw the map light up with debris reports from the ground. Tiny yellow dots like embers scattering away from the path. And for a moment, the room smelled like burnt coffee and fear. We tried to calibrate. We tried to fit what we were seeing into what we knew. Foam hits during Ascent could cause damage, yes. But the leading edge is made of reinforced carbon-carbon, baked and tested beyond common failure. The models told us damage should be limited. The models have to tell us more than we are willing to feel. At 9:00 p.m., the horizon was coming up under Columbia, and we were folding years of habit into a tight choreography. Families watched in living rooms and schoolrooms and bars, their faces lit by screens. My mother called once to ask if everything was okay. I told her yes, because it was easier to let the truth sit in my mouth than to give it breath. My daughter, Ellie, had been at my sister's house for the night, asleep, safe. I thought of the card she'd made, the crayon rockets with wobbly flames. I thought about what it meant to have your life hang mostly in the hands of people who love the math. And then the telemetry began to look like a river breaking its banks. Temperature sensors along the left wing continued to rise in a pattern that suggested a loss of thermal protection. The reentry profile needed the wing to keep heat away from structure. If the heat socks got loose, if the surface were compromised, the underlying aluminum would soften like sugar in a flame. The readouts correlated with a descending line on the oscilloscope that looked wrong in a way that made my stomach a clock that had stopped. We started issuing commands to change vector slightly, to compensate, to protect, to find a place in the atmosphere that the shuttle could survive. The crew were talking to us. Their voices were clear and calm. We were trained to believe in the calmness of professionals. It is a dangerous faith. The third microhook, someone at the console next to me, said quietly, "We have loss of vehicle," and for a second I misheard. I thought they meant loss of telemetry, loss of data. But no. The words were the unadorned thing they were, loss of vehicle. The room filled with a silence that wasn't silence. It was a compression, an intake that needed to be answered. My fingers found the photo of Ellie, and I brought it out like a charm. For a dizzying second, I could only think of the playground, the swing's rhythm. The mission timeline is precise. Grief is not. Grief arrives like a fault line and takes everything small that once fit together. We executed the emergency protocols because the world teaches us, always, to do what we can. We tried to bring the console data together into a coherent narrative. The voice loop recorded sparks, and then nothing. There was a point when the line on the screen simply terminated. The room's lights felt too bright. People moved with an odd, polite speed, as if we were all walking in water. The flight director, my boss, someone who had my faith and my wrath, sat with a jaw that had become a hard, closed thing. We called the families. Names in rows on our monitors became people with birthdays, with small things like favorite ice cream flavors, with a need to be held in the simplest possible ways. My voice, when I spoke, sounded wrong to my own ears. Too loud, too thin. I read a list of names that day like a litany. Each syllable a pebble dropped into a well. The fourth micro hook. Afterwards, in the days that followed, someone would ask what we could have done differently. And the answer is not a single sentence. It is an accumulation of choices that, in retrospect, look like a path to a cliff. I kept thinking of the camera that never took that picture of the wing, a small omission that widens into the shape of a life. That thought haunted me more than any diagnostic readout. People find it easier to argue numbers than to weigh what it means to say, we did not ask the right questions. For weeks, months, really, I lived inside the sound of that day. The public inquiries, the press, the grief that seemed to pervade entire neighborhoods like a slow fog. There were families waiting at the edge of our offices, names on their lips like prayers. We handed out what we had: logs, reports, cautious phrases. I learned to translate technical halts into language that could be held. No euphemisms, no mathematical comfort. We are investigating, we said, and it was true and also hollow. On nights when the city slept differently and sleep would not come, I would walk to the darkened courtyard and try to make sense of sequences of events like beads strung on a thread. Launch, foam strike, unobserved damage, reentry, anomaly. Each bead had weight. The string held them in place. The truth wanted to be a straight line. Reality was always more tangled. The colleagues I trusted most became, in the months that followed, a mirror of my own conscience. We reconstructed everything. Telemetry again, oral histories. The grainy footage of Ascent replayed until the pixels blurred. The investigatory board wanted causation. We wanted meaning. The difference between those two things would be the measure of our work and the measure of our personal reckonings. I testified in rooms under bright lights and asked myself frequently how to compress the immensity of a single decision into a soundbite. Memory is not a thing you can sign off. It keeps returning with new detail and new questions. There are nights when the city will surprise you with a small, ordinary mercy. A neighbor's dog barks, a delivery truck rattles, and the world shifts from being a slate wiped clean by tragedy to something more manageable. Small moments of neighborliness that remind you nothing is purely tragic. But there are other nights when solitude becomes a bitter stew of what-ifs. I learned to live with the guilt in the same way I learned to live with the cold on my hands when I sleep, a presence I cannot remove. I went back to work because the only antidote to fear, for me, has always been the work itself, the stubborn, minute procedures that keep machines from killing. In that work, I told the truth of our limits and tried to make the space where a similar mistake could not fit twice. The years that followed were not kind in a tidy way. They were a series of careful repairs, of design changes and procedural overhauls. We learned, we documented, we tried to make the system kinder to human hearts. Now, when I see a child at a science fair with a crayon rocket and a face like a bell, I stop and talk. I tell them what it means to love the sky and what it costs. I tell them there are no guarantees, only calculations, and the warmth of the people who will sit with you when the numbers fail. If you are going to do this work, I tell them, do it with your eyes open and your hands ready to hold the people you love. I keep a little ritual every February, no matter where I am. I write the names of the crew on a strip of paper and fold it into my wallet. It is a dumb, private thing, but it keeps me steady. People say the shuttle was a machine of an earlier age, heroic, dangerous, necessary. Maybe. I think of it as a mirror that showed us our best audacity and our most human blind spots. We taught ourselves, painfully, to be careful in new ways. The world moved on in the way worlds do. New programs, new arguments about risk and funding. A younger cohort of engineers whose faces are not weathered by the same kind of guilt. Sometimes, late at night when the city has folded into itself, I open my drawer and pull out the old flight logs. They smell faintly of coffee and insulation. There are segments highlighted in my own handwriting, regret and tenderness braided together in ink. I read the transcripts of the final minutes because we owe them the dignity of being remembered with precision. I read the commands, the calmness of professionals who had trained to be the best version of themselves in the worst conditions. I read, and I let the grief be what it is, a weight I will carry without apology. There will always be a part of me that asks, what if? What if we had insisted on that image? What if the chain of command had bent? What if the numbers had told a different story? Those questions do not have satisfying answers. What they have are consequences, and those consequences shaped policy and people and the way we move into the sky now. My daughter asked me once if I was scared of rockets. I told her truthfully, "No, Ellie, I am scared of not trying." She looked at me like a philosopher and asked, "But what if you were wrong?" There is no perfect answer to that for a child. I told her, "Then we fix what we can and we remember so we do better next time." It has been years, and the scar has softened but not vanished. I can watch launches now without the same clinical aftertaste, a little shorter of breath, a little more careful about the small rituals. When Columbia's anniversary comes, the museum puts up a display. People leave flowers and sticky notes and folded paper rockets. I go sometimes, alone, to stand before the small glass and look at a thing that was also a person. My reflection in the glass is a ghost next to the artifacts, and for a second I understand how memory is a way of holding. We are not the only ones who blame ourselves when the worst happens, but perhaps we are the only ones who can turn that blame into something that changes the protocol, enhances the design, protects the next crew. At night, when the city's lights soften and the sky is a black velvet that seems at once indifferent and intimate, I think of that white point on the horizon the day Columbia came home the hardest way. I think of the silent ways people grieve, through petitions and vigils, through quiet acts of remembrance, through redesigns and committees, and the stubborn desire to learn. I think of my daughter growing up and asking not to be shielded from the truth, but to be taught how to meet it. There are no miracles here, only humankind trying to balance on the edge of the possible. We did the only thing we could with the knowledge and tools we had. We tried to make sense, and then we tried to do better. The shapes of the mistakes are long and complicated. The work we did afterward was slow and deliberate. I still keep the photograph of Ellie in my pocket. It is a small thing, but it is proof that we made something that endures beyond the machines. The sky will keep taking and giving. We will keep standing beneath it, hands raised, learning how to be kinder to the fragile, brave metal. And to the fragile, brave people who ride inside. In the months after the accident, the world around me felt rearranged, as if someone had quietly tilted the floor a few degrees when I wasn't looking. I went back to work out of instinct, the way a person reaches for a railing in the dark. But the mission control building felt different, quieter in some corners, louder in others. People walked like they were learning the geometry of grief. The angles you avoid, the hallways that hurt to cross, the conversations that collapse in your hands because someone says a name you weren't ready to hear. I became, without meaning to, the person reporters asked for comments from. The engineer closest to the thermal profiles, the one who argued for additional imaging. They wanted sentences that wrapped tragedy into something portable, but I could never give them that. I spoke the truth as cleanly as I could, that systems fail because people are fallible, that people fail because systems give them places to hide from hard questions, that our job was to strip away every hiding place until only honesty remained. The hearings went on for weeks, then months. I testified 3 times. I sat under white lights so bright they washed everyone's faces into chalk. I explained the behavior of reinforced carbon-carbon, the micrometeorite tolerances, the thermal limits of aluminum alloy. But the moment that undid me was not technical. One member of the board asked gently, "If you had gotten that wing image, what do you believe would have happened?" The room seemed to shrink around that question. I answered quietly, "I believe we would have confronted the damage, and even if that confrontation didn't save them, I believe they deserved that knowledge. They deserved for us to look." That was the truth I had been carrying like a live wire inside my ribs, and saying it out loud felt like setting it down on a table between strangers. When the hearings ended, the world didn't snap back into place. It settled into a new shape, one we all had to learn by feel. Some people left NASA. Some stayed and hardened. Some stayed and softened. I wasn't sure which one I had become. Ellie was 10 by then. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table while I graded reports, her legs swinging in little arcs under the chair. She had a way of watching me like she was timing something, waiting for the right moment. "Mom," she said finally, "why do you keep doing this job if it hurts you?" I looked up, startled. Children ask questions without armor. Adults spend years relearning that skill. "It doesn't always hurt," I said. "Only when we get reminders of how much it matters." She nodded like she was making a small, private decision. "If I grow up and do space stuff, will it make you scared?" "Yes," I said, "and proud, and probably annoying with safety checklists." She laughed and came to sit beside me. Her small hand found mine on the table. "Then I want to be brave, enough to do it anyway." Her courage, so matter-of-fact and unadorned, struck me deeper than any briefing or memorial. Something inside me softened, not an erasure of the grief, but a reshaping of it. Weeks turned into years. The technical investigation produced recommendations so long they felt like a scripture. Imaging requirements, Ascent inspections, reinforced procedures, new materials for wing leading edges. We adopted them, debated them, rewrote them, lived inside them. And I watched good people try, with an earnestness that moved me, to prevent another catastrophe written in the sky. But fixing the hardware was only half the work. The other half was quieter and more human. Learning to listen when someone's gut said, "Look again." Learning that dissent isn't disrespect. Learning that caution is sometimes the most courageous form of ambition. About a year after the accident, I stood in the hangar where Columbia had once been prepared for launch. The cavernous room smelled faintly of sealant and old sunlight. They had hung a 7-pointed star near the entrance, each point for a crew member. Under it sat a small display, not much bigger than a school desk. Inside it lay fragments of metal, twisted, scorched, recognizable only to those who once touched them daily. I found myself reaching out, not to touch the glass, but to steady myself. A memory rose unbidden. The night before that final landing, when I had run my fingers along the console and whispered a quick promise to the universe that everything would be okay. It is the helpless prayer of those who know the math, but still hope for mercy. Someone stepped beside me. It was Commander Rivera, retired now, but once a pilot I had worked closely with. He was older, slower, but his eyes carried the same blue clarity. Hard to come in here, he said. Yes, I said. But harder not to. He nodded. You stayed. After everything. So did you. He gave a quiet smile. Someone has to teach the next generation what this place costs. We stood together for a long moment, two people bound by an invisible thread of memory and stubbornness. Then he said something I've never forgotten. Spaceflight was never safe, but it can be safer, and sometimes the only way we learn that is the hardest way possible. Years passed, NASA changed, vehicles changed, cultures changed, and I changed too. One spring afternoon, when the air smelled like warm concrete and blooming jasmine, the first test flight of a new spacecraft was scheduled. I was on the review team, not mission control this time, but oversight. One level higher than I'd been during Columbia. The work was quieter but heavier, like holding a fragile object in both hands and knowing it is not yours to drop. We sat in a conference room as the countdown played through speakers. The younger engineers leaned forward, bright with fear and excitement. Their faces reflected that particular radiance of people witnessing the edge of the possible. When the engines lit, the room glowed. I watched the plume rise on the monitor like a pillar of daylight. At T-160 seconds, someone whispered, "Nominal." It felt like an exhale shared by everyone in the room. Later, when the spacecraft completed its mission and returned safely, the celebration in the building was soft, respectful. Not champagne and shouting, but relief moving through 100 chests at once. I stepped into a stairwell to gather myself. My hands were trembling in a familiar, almost forgotten way. We had done it. We had built something safer. Not perfect. Nothing human ever is. But safer. That night, I drove to the outskirts of town with Ellie, who was now almost a teenager and already talking about aerospace engineering, as if it were a place she planned to set down roots. We parked near a field where the sky opened wide, a velvet bowl filled with stars. "Do you still think about them?" she asked quietly. "Every day," I said. She pointed upward. "Do you think they'd be proud of what you did?" I didn't answer immediately. The wind rustled the field grass, making a sound like 1,000 small breaths. "I don't know," I said at last. "But I hope the work honors them. I hope the sky is kinder now because of what they gave." We sat there until the air grew cold and the stars sharpened, and I felt something inside me settle, a kind of peace that didn't erase the sorrow but learned to coexist with it. In later years, I would speak at universities, at memorials, at conferences where young engineers carried notebooks and old engineers carried caution. I told them the truth I learned too late, that courage in aerospace isn't only found in the sky. It is found in the room where someone says, "I think something is wrong," and someone else says, "Show me." It is found in listening. It is found in humility. It is found in remembering. On the 20th anniversary of the accident, I visited the memorial again. Fresh flowers lay at the base. A group of schoolchildren filed past, chattering softly. One of them, a girl with a braid and bright, curious eyes, looked up at the star and whispered to her friend, "I want to fly one day." I felt a soft ache in my chest, not pain, something gentler. Hope. Outside, the sky stretched wide and blue, unscarred by the memories it held. I closed my eyes and let the sunlight warm my face. I thought of Columbia, of the crew, of the people who had shaped my life in ways they never knew. I thought of the way grief can become a compass, not pointing backward, but forward, toward the work left to do. When I opened my eyes, I felt steadier. The sky had taken so much from us, and still, impossibly, I loved it. Still, impossibly, I believed in reaching upward. I turned away from the memorial and walked toward the future we had been building, piece by painstaking piece, one lesson at a time. And for the first time in many years, the future did not feel like a debt. It felt like an inheritance. It felt like something worth giving and worth continuing. Even after the hardest day the sky ever handed me, even after everything, even because of it.